Hello, just before the podcast begins, I want to tell you about The Assassination. It's a new podcast series from the BBC World Service. My name's Owen Bennett-Jones, and I used to be the BBC's correspondent in Pakistan, and for years covered the story of one of the world's best-known politicians, Benazir Bhutto. Then she was assassinated. The Assassination is all about my 10-year investigation into what happened. There are already 7 episodes with more to come. Search for The Assassination wherever you get your podcasts.
This is the BBC. For details of our complete range of programmes, go to bbcworldservice.com/podcasts.
Welcome to the latest global news, compiled in the early hours of the morning on Thursday, the 8th of February. I'm Emilio Sampedro with a selection of highlights from across BBC World Service News today. Coming up, the leader of the Republicans in the U.S. Senate welcomes a deal that could help avoid another government shutdown.
No one would suggest it is perfect, but we worked hard to find common ground and stay focused on serving the American people.
And in a rare moment of consensus, his Democratic counterpart agrees.
After months of fiscal brinkmanship, this budget deal is the first real sprout of bipartisanship.
Somaliland passes a religious edict banning some forms of female genital mutilation. Also, the high-tech glasses making it easier for police in China to catch suspects.
The software inside the glasses can match the faces that the glasses are able to scan with faces in the database and see if they can make a match for a potential suspect.
Plus, we meet the Syrian refugee-turned-chef serving traditional Syrian food in Colombia's capital city, Bogota.
She teach me about, for example, how the falafel, falafel is more good this color. She teach me how I do everything, not only recipe, but with my eyes.
That's all coming up, but we begin in the United States, where a couple of days before it runs out of money, the U.S. government has reached a 2-year budget deal.
This bill is the product of extensive negotiations among congressional leaders and the White House. No one would suggest it is perfect, but we worked hard to find common ground and stay focused on serving the American people.
That's the Republican Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, and in a rare display of American lawmakers coming together, his Democratic Party counterpart, Chuck Schumer, agreed.
After months of fiscal brinkmanship, this budget deal is the first real sprout of bipartisanship, and it should break the long cycle of spending crises that have snarled this Congress and hampered our middle class.
The BBC's Anthony Zerker in Washington told us more about the deal.
Well, it involves a 2-year way out of the budget showdowns that we've been faced with here in the United States over the past few months by raising these caps on both military and domestic discretionary spending that had been in place since a budget deal back in 2011. I mean, if you remember back then, everyone was concerned about deficits. Well, it seems like now the politicians, their way of getting out of this and finding a compromise is to stop worrying about deficits, increasing spending both $80 billion next year for defense and $63 billion for Democrats' domestic spending priorities, and then even more the year after that. There's going to be some opposition from Democrats in the House of Representatives who wanted some sort of an immigration deal included in this, and from conservative budget hawks who are still concerned about runaway budget deficits, looking at about $1 trillion in the next year of a budget deficit. But I think both sides are happy that these showdowns are going to be over at least for a little while.
So what does this mean for this a deal that was being negotiated along with that for the Dreamers, the immigrant children?
Well, that gets put off to another day, and there is significant opposition among Democrats in the House of Representatives that it didn't get latched on because they figured this was a way of having leverage, of threatening a shutdown, of jeopardizing military spending unless they get some sort of immigration deal. There's promises on the Senate side to address this and reach some sort of compromise, probably protections for these immigrants who came over as undocumented when they were children, in addition to funding for, say, Donald Trump's border wall, increased security security, maybe changes in immigration levels, but there's no guarantee that there's going to be any sort of compromise in the House. So we're looking at a March deadline where some of the people who are covered by this DACA program that Obama instituted start to expire, but they've just put off those negotiations to another day.
But I guess for the time being, they're putting off also a future or another government shutdown.
Exactly. We're looking at that kind of brinkmanship being gone at least for 2 years. And I think there's a lot of relief with the midterm elections looming in November to not have to worry about that.
Anthony Zerker. After months of haggling, Angela Merkel has secured an agreement with her political rivals which would give her a fourth term as German Chancellor. She's managed to renew the grand coalition with the centre-left Social Democrats, the SPD. But the deal comes at a big cost for Mrs. Merkel. She's lost control of the finance ministry. This could mean the end of an era of tight budget discipline in Germany and the rest of the Eurozone. The SPD's leader, Martin Schulz, who would become the foreign minister, favors less austerity and a closer European Union. Mrs. Merkel insists the deal gives her country a strong future.
Ich bin überzeugt, der Koalitionsvertrag, den wir gemeinsam erarbeitet haben,
I am convinced the coalition agreement we worked out together can be a basis for a good and stable government, which our country needs, and, by the way, many around the world expect from us. It can be a working plan which will improve life in Germany. It will lead our country into the future and will help to keep our economy competitive and strengthen social cohesion.
But the agreement could still fall through. It's subject to a vote of approval by the SPD's 464,000 members. Many grassroots activists are reluctant to work with Mrs. Merkel's centre-right Christian Democrats. She couldn't rely on other parties to form a government after suffering a disappointing result in September's general election. Our Berlin correspondent is Damien McGuinness.
It's really seen here as the least bad option. No one really wants it, but neither side fancies the alternatives. That's the real problem. So the alternatives would be a minority government, and that's seen generally as unstable. Angela Merkel has pretty much ruled it out. The other option would have been fresh elections, and that would lead to months of uncertainty and could kill off Emmanuel Macron's plans to reform the Eurozone. Now, the resulting deal we have is essentially a list of pragmatic compromises that benefit both sides. You could see it as almost a laundry list of tax giveaways, spending pledges, and Angela Merkel says that this will really make people's lives easier. So it's sort of essentially a way of pleasing both sides. But the danger is, of course, if you try and please everyone, you please no one.
And as part of the deal, the SPD are getting the foreign and finance ministries. What does this mean for Germany and Europe?
Yeah, so these two ministries are seen as two of the most powerful. Traditionally, the junior partner, which is, the past two of the three coalition governments, that's been the Social Democrats. They've taken this foreign ministry role. So that's been traditionally what's happened over the past decade and a half in Germany anyway. The finance ministry is new, and that's really significant because the centre-left Social Democrats have a very amenable stance towards German help for other Eurozone countries, particularly southern struggling Eurozone economies. The other big thing about this coalition deal really is also the pledges to increase spending. So we've had record tax intakes in Germany over the last few years. That's now leading to a spending spree here, partly thanks to this coalition deal. If all goes ahead as planned, they're going to build homes, improve services, infrastructure. These are things that many economists have called on Germany to do for a long time. That'll have a knock-on impact for the rest of the EU as well, because the more that Germany's economy grows, the more that consumption here grows, the more that'll help the rest of the Eurozone. So what we've really seen is a focus on Europe in these coalition talks, and that's really what SPD leader Martin Schulz, of course himself a former European Parliament president, has said as well. He's called this deal a fresh start for Europe.
What's in this coalition deal about the European Union and its future is a paradigm shift in Europe. Germany will return to having an active and leading role in the European Union.
So what about Angela Merkel? How does she come out of all of this? Is she strengthened or weakened?
I think it really depends on how the SPD members' vote goes. If the result is yes, then a government could be in place by Easter. Now, then Angela Merkel's in quite a strong position because she's managed to get together, despite these difficult numbers that came out of the election, managed to get together a government. If, though, the SPD vote no, then clearly Angela Merkel is severely weakened. That would then lead to probably, most likely, fresh elections, which would mean months more of instability. And then Angela Merkel is in a very tricky position. But then all of German politics is in a tricky position, are the other party leads as well. So it wouldn't just be Angela Merkel, it would be everyone else, really.
Damien McGuinness. Syrian activists say the continuing bombardment by government forces of the last big rebel-held area near Damascus has killed another 32 civilians. More than 100 people have died in the eastern Ghouta region in the past 2 days, according to a monitoring group. The United Nations has called for a ceasefire so it can deliver humanitarian aid. From Beirut, our Middle East correspondent Quentin Somerville sent this report.
Regime warplanes again bombarded eastern Ghouta near Damascus. Their bombs are unguided and tumble haphazardly through the sky. More than 100 people have been killed in the last 48 hours. About a quarter of them are children. It's chaos on the ground as rescuers, the Civil Defence Force or White Helmets, struggle to free those trapped in destroyed buildings. The town of Douma is under siege. One man there, who didn't want to be named, described the situation.
We have a residential building destroyed from airstrike. Women and children died under rubble. Civilian defense stay hours trying to get them away. We have water, hardly have some electricity, but the problem is with medicine. We have more than 700 casualties. They could die any moment.
Since the new year, there have been 6 cases of suspected chlorine gas attacks. Hospitals and clinics have been targeted directly. In one, premature babies had to be evacuated from incubators. Ghouta, along with Idlib in the northwest, is meant to be a de-escalation zone where attacks are discouraged. It's part of an attempt to end the nearly 7-year conflict. But the regime and its allies are mounting multiple offensives against rebel and jihadist-held areas. So attacks have intensified, not reduced, and civilian casualties have soared.
Quentin Somerville. It sounds like something out of a film, like RoboCop, facial recognition sunglasses that can detect fugitives in crowds. Well, Chinese police are now using them. It comes as hundreds of millions of people in China begin traveling for the Lunar New Year holiday. China already has 170 million CCTV cameras. Our Asia-Pacific editor, Celia Hatton, told us more.
These glasses feature the latest in cutting-edge facial recognition technology. So basically, these glasses have a little camera right on the corner of them, and the camera can scan faces in the crowd in front of the person who's wearing the glasses. The camera is then connected on a network to a police database and can effectively, the software inside the glasses can match the faces that the glasses are able to scan with faces in the database and see if they can make a match for a potential suspect. The makers of these glasses, it's a company from Beijing, says that the glasses can scan a database with 10,000 faces in 100 milliseconds. It's basically been quite effective for police in China. They've been using them across China, and in just one city in central China, police have been able to catch 7 suspects with crimes ranging from human trafficking to hit-and-run accidents, and they've also caught another 26 people who were found to be using fake IDs.
Now, these databases, are they of people who've already been arrested or committed crimes in the past?
Well, China isn't shy about collecting information on its own citizens. So, no, in the Chinese case, they've been very clear that they basically take the information every time you have an ID photo taken, that information is then stored in police databases. If you are a tourist, you travel to China on a visa, your photo that you submit for your visa application, that will also go in the database. Many critics who are looking at China's increasing use of facial recognition technology are really crying foul on this. They're saying, look, you're obviously using this to track people who might not agree with the Chinese government, to track political dissidents. It's also thought that this technology is being used in the Chinese autonomous region of Xinjiang, which is where Chinese ethnic Uyghur Muslims are really thought to be repressed on quite an extreme scale.
What reaction has there been?
There's There's been a bit of reaction. I mean, any highly critical comments are going to get scrubbed from the internet, so it's difficult. But we're getting comments that are similar to the one that you made, Emilio, that these glasses are like those you might see in a movie, like Mission Impossible or RoboCop. Over time, people in China are getting used to the idea of facial recognition technology. Now in China, some airlines will allow you to board a plane without a boarding pass. They simply will scan your face. China has been very clever in some ways in trying to introduce this technology in quite innocuous ways so people can get used to it. For example, in one Beijing tourist attraction, it dispenses toilet paper by looking at your face. So only one person can get a little bit of toilet paper at a time, so other people can't hog all the toilet paper. So they've kind of been introducing the concept in kind of these softly ways, step by step. And now they're really starting to bring it out and show that it's being used by the police.
Celia Hatton. Thousands of Rohingya Muslims were driven out of Myanmar's Rakhine state last year by a campaign carried out by the Burmese military with the support of local ultra-nationalist monks. But now many Rakhine Buddhists fear that their identity is being threatened, as our Southeast Asia correspondent Jonathan Head discovered on a rare visit to Rakhine's ancient capital.
An angry crowd converges on a local government office in Rauk-U, a small town in western Myanmar. These are the indigenous people of Rakhine State, Buddhists often accused of working with the military to attack Muslim Rohingyas. But the Rakhine have their own grievances with the government. Here they're protesting against a ban on them, commemorating the Burmese conquest of what was then called Arakan more than 200 years ago. 7 protesters were later shot dead by the police.
We really feel that we are still under colonialism because we don't have any power, we don't have a self-determination, we don't feel we are in freedom.
Tun Ne Win is a Rakhine activist. He's also a tour guide.
All the statues, all the Buddha images were made in 1535.
He showed me around one of the spectacular 16th century temples that dot the scrubby landscape outside Rauk-U, remnants of what was then one of the most powerful trading kingdoms in the region. Their sense of humiliating decline since then haunts the Rakhine, now living in one of the poorest and most isolated parts of Myanmar. Farmers here use the simplest technology. This one's making cows tread his rice crop. He can't afford even basic machinery. There's little electricity. Health and education are primitive. And the Rakhine directs their anger over this at the government and at their Muslim neighbours. A group of Rakhine women talked to me about how relations with Muslims had broken down 5 years ago. They described frequent fights and brutal attacks. We can't live with them anymore, they said. What changed? I asked them. They weren't sure. We used to live together like brothers and sisters, one said. She blames the government for stirring up trouble. But the Rohingyas came off much worse in the violence that erupted in this part of Rakhine 5 years ago. Dozens of Muslims died. The rest were confined to their villages or to squalid camps. There are Muslim communities in this part of Rakhine State, and we're passing through one now. You can see them standing beside the road, quite distinctive looking from the Rakhine, who are also in this area, but we're banned from any contact with Rohingyas without permission. We're being followed by special branch police. In fact, for most foreigners, they'd be completely invisible. We did find one Rohingya family working in fields near the road after we'd lost our police escort. They agreed to talk. They described a life of constant restrictions and constant fear of the security forces and of their Buddhist neighbours. The time may come, he said, when we too have to flee to Bangladesh. If they do go, the Rakhine Buddhists don't want them back. I found an unshakable belief among them that their existence as a distinct ethnic group is threatened by the huge Muslim population next door. Tunne Win explained.
We are just trying to exist, our identity, our people. Otherwise, maybe 50 years later, maybe 100 years later, Rakhine will disappear.
Rakhine State has been blighted by neglect, fear and repression on all communities for so long, it's hard to see how they can be reconciled and the Rohingyas brought home. There's little evidence yet that the government is even trying.
Jonathan Head reporting from Myanmar's Rakhine State. You're listening to Global News, the most important stories and the best interviews and on-the-spot reporting from the BBC World Service. Every weekend you can hear a review of the week's main news stories and why they matter. That's in the world this week. And the programme's also available to download from our website, bbc.co.uk/programmes. The self-declared Republic of Somaliland has issued a fatwa or religious edict banning some forms of female genital mutilation or FGM. It said those who perform FGM would face punishment and victims would be eligible for compensation. The practice is almost universal in Somaliland and affects 98% of women and girls there, the highest rate in the world. My colleague Razia Iqbal spoke to Nimco Ali from Somaliland, who has herself been a victim of the practice. She co-founded an organization called Daughters of Eve.
So I had FGM when I was 7 and I was on my way back to the UK. So we went from Somaliland, what is Somaliland now, to Djibouti, and I had one of the most invasive forms of FGM, which is type 3. So yeah, obviously I was cut. I had part of my clitoris removed and some of my labia, and then whatever was left was kind of stitched together. So there are 3 specific kinds of FGM, but there's also the 4th now that World Health Organization have talked about. So type 1 is a clitoridectomy. Type 2 is the clitoridectomy alongside some removal of the labia, either the majora or the minora, and then type 3 is the clitoridectomy type with the removal of or partial removal of the lips as well, and then everything that's left kind of stitched together. So that's the most invasive. I never say which one is worse than the other because every woman has her own experience. And then I came back to the UK. I didn't know what type of FGM I had, so that's why I'm never very specific about the types. And I had complications due to that when I was 11 and had a defibrillation, which was basically just to reopen my anatomy.
So this happened to you when you were 7. At what stage did you start to become aware that this was something that perhaps women needed more agency over and needed to speak out about?
I think my story is a little bit different because I was very egalitarian in my household. That's where I always say my FGM happened completely out of context. Like, I was freely educated. I wasn't pushed into a certain religion or anything else. So for me, I was very uncomfortable with the act of FGM at the beginning. I didn't think it was wrong. I didn't think it was illegal. I just thought it was uncomfortable, and I searched for answers to that. But and that's what kind of led me onto my journey to really find out that it's a form of gender-based violence. And I think it was reading Noel Adesolai when I was about 11, 12 that really got me into that position.
Okay, so now the government in Somaliland have issued, or at least the authorities have issued, a religious edict banning some forms of female genital mutilation. Well, what's your response to? It feels as though it's quite significant what they're suggesting.
Yeah, so I specifically went back in 2007. So I went back about 6-7 weeks ago. I don't actually know. So I went back in October, just before the election was about to kick off, and I met all 3 candidates. So I went back with the Gates Foundation, who do this thing called goalkeepers, and FGM is a key indicator in Goal 5, which is gender equality. So in order to get a gender equal world, we need to end FGM. So I went there and actually got all 3 presidential candidates to say that if they were elected, they would pass legislation. And I am happy to say that I was actually surprised at how conducive they were to the conversation and even how progressive they were about it. And Musa eventually did win, and he said it would be the first piece of legislation that he would pass. So I think this religious edict is basically the first step, but any legislation that comes through is about all forms of FGM. So the fact that this legislation talks about FGM as a human rights abuse as opposed to a harm, because what happens is that we talk about the harm of FGM, so then what do we do? Make it safer. And the most growing form of FGM in the world is the medicalization of FGM. There's about 16 million girls added to the statistics globally who have undergone FGM by a medical profession.
Razia Iqbal speaking to Nimco Ali of the anti-FGM organization Daughters of Eve. Kenya's top judge has told the government to obey court rulings or risk being accused of violating the constitution. In a rare public statement, the Chief Justice criticized the government for not following court orders to release a pro-opposition lawyer, Miguna. He was jailed and later deported for his role in the unofficial swearing-in of the opposition leader, Raila Odinga, who says he is the rightful president of Kenya. From Nairobi, Mercy Juma reports.
In his statement, Chief Justice David Maraga said bluntly that compliance with court orders was not optional. Rather, it was a constitutional obligation. He vowed to ensure the rule of law and justice were upheld in the country. His remarks came as the Kenyan government gave its justification as to why it deported the opposition politician and lawyer Miguna in defiance of a court order to release him on bail.
Mercy Juma. Researchers say they believe a protein found in many foods, including asparagus, could play a key role in the spread of breast cancer. It's an amino acid called asparagine. I've been speaking to our health correspondent, James Gallagher.
This was all experiments on mice, and these mice had an incredibly aggressive form of breast cancer. Now, some early research had hinted that asparagine may be critical for those cancers spreading. So the researchers tried several different ways of limiting asparagine in the mice. So they went on special diets, so they weren't getting any dietary asparagine. They were given drugs that blocked the production of asparagine in the body. And what it showed was that they could reduce the number of tumours spreading from basically lows, this was an incredibly aggressive type of cancer, to something they could barely spot. It had a remarkable impact on the spread of breast cancer in these experiments.
And this amino acid, asparagine, can be made by the body, but it's also found in certain foods?
Well, it was named after asparagus, if you were thinking about it. Sounds slightly familiar. But it's found in lots of different, basically any protein, so loads of meat, but also vegetable-based proteins, so lots of plants produce proteins of their own. It's going to be very hard to eliminate it completely from your diet. So the plan that these scientists have is they're thinking of maybe some kind of milkshake that you would drink when you were diagnosed with cancer, and that would be nutritionally balanced for absolutely everything you needed, except it would have zero asparagine in it. So that's how they're visioning it happening in the future. It wouldn't be possible for you to eliminate it from your diet, or at least it would be very difficult.
And how significant is this in the fight against breast cancer?
Well, you have to remember breast cancer has had huge successes. I mean, the death rates from breast cancer are falling incredibly rapidly. But what is really interesting about this research, it's this sense that cancers may be addicted, may be dependent on certain components of our diet, and that by changing those, we may be able to alter the course of the disease. Now, that is an avenue that hasn't really been pursued yet. You read a lot of fake news out there, Emilio. You know, this particular food will stop you getting cancer. It's nearly all a complete pile of rubbish. But the theory that actually there may be some components of our diet that are preventing or slowing or affecting cancer looks like it might be true. The problem is they now need to do the real science to work out what are those things that we need.
James Gallagher. The former Pope Benedict, who retired 5 years ago, has said in a rare public statement that he's preparing for the end of his life. He made his comments in a letter to the Italian newspaper Corriere della Sera after readers expressed concerns about his health. Here's Daniel Mann.
Benedict, who's 90, is now Pope Emeritus, which means although he's retired, he keeps the title he held for almost 8 years. He stunned the world in 2013 when he said that his health was deteriorating and he could no longer meet the demands of leading an estimated 1.2 billion Roman Catholics.
Vires meas, in gravescente etate, non iam aptas...
Benedict, one of the oldest ever popes, was the first pontiff to step down in 7 centuries. He denied speculation that he was forced to resign. His papacy was dominated by the child sex abuse scandal involving priests. Benedict retired to a monastery in the gardens of Vatican City to serve the church through a life dedicated to prayer and has made only several public appearances. The former pope, who has lost control of his hands, said in the letter which was published on the front page of Corriere della Sera that he was moved so many people wanted to know about his frail health and how he spent his days in this, the closing period of his life. He said that with the slow withering of his physical forces and the last stretch of a sometimes tiring path, he was internally on a pilgrimage towards home, the house of the Lord, surrounded by a degree of love and goodwill that he could never have imagined.
Daniel Mann. This story takes place in Colombia, but it began in Damascus. It's been nearly 7 years since the civil war began in Syria. According to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, 4.8 million Syrians have fled the country. Most seek asylum in nearby countries such as Lebanon and Turkey. But one Syrian refugee-turned-chef is serving traditional Syrian food in Colombia's capital city, Bogota, from where Cady Vogue reports.
The smell of roasting meats and spices, unfamiliar to locals here, waft out of a small restaurant called Al Banoun. Al-Motaz is just inside, preparing a chicken shawarma for a regular customer. Colombia is not known as a target destination for refugees, but Al-Motaz had his eyes set on Bogota long before he fled his home in Damascus, because he came here for love.
When I see my wife in the first time, I feel something is different. She explained about her country, about her dreams, asked me about my country, about my dreams, about my study. I feel so happy.
Jessica and Al-Motaz first met over Skype in 2010. A mutual friend suggested they speak, as a way for them both to practice their English.
When I see Al-Motaz for first time, I feel he's so special and so lovely and gentleman, and he's one man that really take my heart.
When his family's grocery store in Damascus was bombed in 2013, Al-Motaz decided he would go to Jessica. He fled to Istanbul and planned to work and save for the flight to Colombia. But after 6 months, he was hardly making ends meet and began to lose hope that he would ever make it. Until he met Abu Fares, a Syrian man in Istanbul working to try to help new refugees in the city. He loved the story of their unlikely romance, and one day he came to Al-Motaz.
He told me, look, I won't help you, but I want change the image of Muslim in the world. All the people know about us. We are terrorists. We are so difficult people. I want you change this image in Colombia. I want you help your wife, and I don't want anything.
Abu Fares paid the $3,000 plane ticket, and a month later, Al-Motaz and Jessica were finally together in Colombia. But when Al-Motaz struggled to find work, his mother suggested she teach him how to cook over Skype.
She teach me about, for example, how the falafel, falafel is more good this color, how you do shawarma with meat is good, with chicken not good. She teach me how I do everything, not only recipe, but with my eyes.
With the help of a small grant from an NGO, he was able to buy a food cart and start his business. Now, he and Jessica have a restaurant and a 2-year-old son. They also want to start a foundation to help other new refugees settle in Colombia.
Our dream is that, for example, Syrians arrive here without any money. We can help or start one business. The people can start the new life here in Colombia.
And they have big plans to expand their business.
I put all my love in this food. For this, I want all the people taste my food, know about my country. I want my restaurant in all the world.
Al-Motaz ending that report by Cady Vogue reporting from Bogota. And that's all from us for now, but an updated version of the Global News podcast will be available for you to download later. If you want to comment on this podcast or the topics covered in it, you can send us an email. The address is globalpodcast@bbc.co.uk. I'm Emilio San Pedro. Until next time, goodbye.